I'm Dr. Lucy Maddox, and A Year to Change Your Mind shares my practical advice from years of offering therapy as a clinical psychologist. Life can be hard sometimes, and it's good to have some tools to help. There's an episode for each month of the year, and in this abridged version for BBC Sounds, you can dip in and listen to any month in any order. For January, decisions and ways to help make changes and stick to them. January can bring with it a lot of pressure to make changes and decisions. What are your New Year resolutions, goals, or mantras? New Year, new you. The focus on New Year resolutions in January goes way back to Roman times, when people promised the two-headed god Janus that they would behave better. People still tend to make changes at the beginning of a new calendar year. Picking a one-shot goal, like booking your first driving lesson, is a good way to capitalise on these landmark time points, rather than longer-term goals that need continual motivation. Goals which are smart are even better. That's specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-limited. Despite one-shot goals being more achievable, common New Year resolutions tend to be longer-term and harder, like weight loss or kicking smoking or alcohol, with dry January becoming increasingly popular. The risk with this is that we pick something so big that we set ourselves up to fail and then feel disheartened. If we want to move towards a bigger goal, then breaking it down into smaller steps is a helpful way to go about it, so we can celebrate achievable wins. The reality of choosing to change and the decision-making processes which go before it can be really painful. I recall very well a January which felt full of change for me. It was preceded by a long period of having to decide whether to take a job opportunity in Bristol or not. It was a promotion, but it meant leaving London, where I'd lived for 13 years, leaving all my friends, my colleagues, a brilliant supervisor, and a job I really loved. One night, I got up to write out an Excel spreadsheet of all the pros and cons of leaving and not leaving. I found that the pros and cons were pretty equal. Even when I used the most logical, rational decision-making processes I knew, I got stuck. Why? One problem was it was impossible to imagine how things would be if I left. I could imagine things going well and working out, and also things going badly. But I didn't know where I'd be living, who I'd be with, what I'd feel like. The move was an unknown quantity, involving an uncertain outcome, as change often does. As humans, we don't do brilliantly with uncertainty. It makes us anxious. It can also get in the way of our ability to problem solve and make decisions. Professor Mark Freeston and his colleagues at Newcastle University have looked at this in the context of people experiencing generalised anxiety disorder, or GAD. GAD is unfocused worry and anxiety, not centred on anything in particular, although it can be exacerbated by specific events. It's a kind of free-floating worry. Mark Freeston found that people with a diagnosis of GAD had good knowledge of problem solving. They just couldn't use it to solve problems. This is pretty much what I felt like when I was trying to decide about that job. It led to analysis paralysis, where I would go over the information that I had, but could never move forward because there was much that I didn't and couldn't know about the future. The social context in which we make our decisions creates an emotional background which is often at least as important as the logical things we weigh up. Often, one of the hardest things about moving is leaving people behind, especially when there's no emotional connection to those friends or loved ones we haven't met yet. It's also worth remembering that decisions can be tiring. Decision fatigue is a real thing. That's why our willpower is less at the end of the day. One study found that parole judges tend to be more likely to let prisoners have a reduced sentence earlier in the day or immediately after they'd had a snack. Energy is needed to help our brains make decisions. A few strategies can help with sticking to changes once we've made a decision. Booking a bunch of exercise classes at once, or putting your running gear out the night before, might be a useful prompt. Anything that makes the behaviour more likely to become an automatic habit. Some of our decision-making processes are unconscious. Daniel Kahneman from Princeton University has spent a long time researching decision-making. He has written extensively about the difference between the fast, intuitive system, which can be involved, and the slower, more logical thinking through that we're also capable of. It's efficient for us to have a quick system that can make decisions fast and can use unconscious information, including memories and emotions. We do a lot of things on automatic pilot day to day, brushing our teeth, taking a familiar route. The speedy system is especially handy if we need to make a lightning quick decision which affects our safety. But it's less useful when it brings in unconscious biases that we justify either at the time or retrospectively without even realising. Biases might be related to outcomes of previous experiences. Unconscious biases might also be related to differences between us and other people involved in a decision. For example, biases related to class, ethnicity, or sex can creep in and influence what we think is a logical decision about someone else. Even though we might tell ourselves a story about why we've made a decision, it's possible that this is a post hoc justification of other factors. I felt quite aware of this with the Bristol-London dilemma. I found myself second-guessing whether I was creating reasons not to go because it felt safer to stay. I emailed a colleague, Eric Morris, who'd moved to Australia a few years before and who worked in the area of acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. One key insight from ACT is that our decisions aren't always best framed in terms of reward and loss. It might help instead to think more about making decisions based on ethical frameworks or on deeply held values which are important to us. Eric told me about how he'd made his decision to move based on core values that included wanting to prioritise his family relationships by working in an environment where the lifestyle meant he could spend time with his children. My values at the time included creativity, adventure-seeking, friends and family, helping others, and learning. I reviewed my options with these values in mind. Basically, there was still no right or wrong answer. Once we accept there is no right or wrong decision, we might also be able to see a decision point as less deterministic. We can decide and then change our mind again if it's not right. How we think about a decision once it's been made can also be important in allowing us to move on from it. Ed Watkins from the University of Exeter has spent a lot of time investigating repetitive thinking styles, which involve thinking the same thing over and over again. Two types of repetitive thinking which can happen after a decision has been made are rumination and counterfactual thinking. Rumination gets its name from the way that cows digest grass. We can chew over and over what we've done or not done. Counterfactual thinking is imagining what might have happened in an alternative version of the past. If only I'd done that. We tend towards counterfactual thinking when we're not feeling happy or when something difficult happens. If we're thinking about something that is abstract, complex, or far off in the future and affected by lots of different factors, then it can be hard for us to solve it using repetitive thinking. And we might be better off thinking at a more concrete level about what to do in the immediate future. So worrying about what to do with the rest of my life is too big a subject to be helpfully tackled by overthinking. Instead, it might be useful to work out what the next course of action might be. The research also suggests that repetitive thinking with negative content is less helpful, so it might be useful to consciously try to balance this out with more positive thoughts. I deliberately tried to imagine what would happen if things worked out well, instead of only focusing on my worst-case scenarios. I did take the new job and move to Bristol. I moved in January when it was tipping it down with rain. To say yes to a new adventure in Bristol, I had to say no to my comfortable life in London. Sometimes it's helpful to acknowledge the loss that comes with any decision. But alongside the losses that accompany decisions and change, there is often much to gain. In my case, a more peaceful pace of living, full of many experiences and joys and connections that I would never have known without moving. And if I had stayed, there would have been other opportunities which I won't ever know about. Making peace with the loss of an unknown future is in some ways as tricky as making peace with more nameable losses. But if you can trust that you are exactly where you're meant to be, it often comes true with that belief. And at least in choosing, you're doing something, rather than making the decision to procrastinate. It can be tempting to think about decisions and change as a one-step process, as a thing we do and then it's done. But in reality, we are choosing to stick to a change at multiple points in time. So once we've decided which way we're going, how can we keep on course? Researchers John Norcross and Dominic Vangarelli followed the efforts of a couple of hundred people in the USA who pledged to change something about their lives at New Year. They followed them up over a 2-year period after these people volunteered in response to a regional TV broadcast. Researchers called the participants up at intervals up until 2 years later. Over 3/4 had kept their resolution at the 1-week follow-up, but by 2 years this had reduced to about a fifth. The authors found that people who were better at keeping their resolutions were more likely to gradually reduce unwanted behaviours and to keep reminders around themselves of the resolution they were trying to stick to. Giving oneself rewards for making changes was also associated with sticking to resolutions. Being in environments which conflicted with the resolution, such as trying to give up smoking but spending time with other smokers, unsurprisingly made it harder to make a change. Lots of people reported times when they accidentally went back to doing whatever it was that they were trying to give up, but 70% reported that this strengthened their resolve. In fact, motivational interviewing, a therapeutic technique used in helping people to give up substance abuse, recognises that falling off the wagon and having continued ambivalence about making a change in our behaviour is entirely normal, something to be worked with. Part of motivational interviewing is making sure that a person really does want to make a change, for themselves and not for anyone else. Sometimes the way we frame a change can affect how we engage with it too. Making a goal an approach goal instead of an avoidance goal can be more motivational. So aim to cut back a cigarette a day rather than aiming not to smoke, or aim to make healthy choices at 2 meals a day instead of aiming to lose weight. Making any change is difficult. It's human to try and fail and need to try again. It might help to take the pressure off and remember that the 1st of January is just another day. We can change things any day we like. Each day, each hour, each moment can be a fresh beginning. Whatever we feel at the stroke of midnight on the 1st of January, we can be sure it will be transient. A Year to Change Your Mind, Episode 2, by me, Dr. Lucy Maddox. This month, how to get going when we're feeling stuck. February. The year I moved to Bristol, it rained a lot. That particular February was bleak. I had to drag myself up in the dark, usually rainy mornings and take 2 buses up to the mental health ward for teenagers where I was working. January and February in the UK are not only wet, they're also dark, and it's easy to feel stagnant at this time of year. Feeling a bit stuck and blue in a cold and difficult month is not the same as feeling depressed, which is a whole step change of difference. The experience of severe depression is bleak and hopeless. People often describe feeling trapped in a cloud with no sense of how to move forward. Depression can suck people's energy and make small things feel unattainable. Depression is associated with something called learned helplessness, a phenomenon researched by psychologist Martin Seligman. In his classic studies, Seligman found that animals who were exposed to trauma that they couldn't control learnt to not bother trying to escape subsequent traumas, even if those traumas were controllable. So dogs who were given electric shocks that they couldn't escape then learnt not to bother trying to avoid the shock, even when they could. In contrast, dogs which had not been exposed to previous uncontrollable trauma tried and succeeded in escaping the shocks when there were escape routes available. Seligman drew a parallel between this and the state of mind we enter when depression is around. We learn a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, which makes us not want to bother trying new things. We presume they will go badly, and this creates a barrier to us trying. One approach to tackling depression is something called behavioural activation, which derives from cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT. In this treatment, people are encouraged to increase their level of activity by identifying things that are important for them, and step by very small step, taking actions which help to work towards doing those things. The first behavioural treatment of depression was created in the 1970s. People were asked to increase the pleasant things they did and the number of positive interactions with their environment. The treatment was based on a theory that people experiencing depression tend to avoid unpleasant thoughts, feelings, and situations, and that a vicious cycle gets set up where that avoidance perpetuates negative feeling. It's easy for someone's world to shrink right down when they're trying to keep themselves safe from disappointment and despair. Behavioural treatments got pushed aside for a while when cognitive treatments came in and focused more on thinking styles. But then, in the 1990s, a psychologist, Neil Jacobson, and colleagues set up an experiment to test which made more difference, changes to behaviour or to thinking. In Neil Jacobson's experiment, 150 people with depression were randomly put into one of three groups. The first group were involved in activity scheduling, which included people keeping track of what they did in a day, rating these things on how much pleasure and how much of a sense of achievement they got out of them, and trying to increase the amount of things which were pleasurable or gave a sense of mastery. These things didn't have to be big. They could be quite small, like managing to post a letter which had been sitting there for ages. The second group also did activity scheduling, but in addition, they were taught to challenge negative automatic thoughts, which are thoughts that pop up unbidden, assuming something negative. The third group did activity scheduling plus a full course of cognitive therapy, which tackles negative automatic thoughts, but also goes deeper into other thoughts and beliefs. The researchers found no meaningful differences between the outcomes of the different groups, either right after the therapy or at 2 years follow-up. People's scores of depression, as rated by the questionnaires they used, were similar across the different treatment conditions that had been offered. They concluded that the behavioural changes were the most important thing, since the addition of thought challenges and full cognitive therapy didn't improve the outcome. This is only one study, and I'm highlighting it to show how powerful behavioural changes can be. Making changes to our behaviour to influence our mood is one of the basic building blocks of CBT for depression. Let's think about Maya, who's completed her undergraduate degree and is living in a flat share with students from her course. Maya's friends are out having fun most evenings, but she feels unable to do the same. She feels anxious in social gatherings, and she feels low in the mornings, unable to get up and out of the flat. Maya feels totally alone and like she's a very different person to everyone around her. Being stuck in a vicious cycle of doing little and having less and less energy or confidence is a deeply miserable place to be. and it can engender learned helplessness. Each morning, Maya continues to stay in bed, feeling increasingly grotty about it. The more she spends her days in bed, the harder it is to get to sleep at night, until she's in a vicious cycle of sleeplessness, low mood, and anxiety. Maya is already having a go at herself for staying in bed. Someone telling her to get up is not going to help. But trying to find some way into what might help her to try new things, however small, might be a more fruitful way in. Maya cares passionately about living a thoughtful and creative life. She also cares about relationships, being someone who treats others with honesty and respect. In addition, Maya loves being in nature. Her flat has a garden, and one thing she thinks about with her therapist is how to use that to help her to get out of bed in the mornings. Her initial aim is getting up and opening her window so she can stick her head outside and see the garden. This progresses to going downstairs to have a cup of tea in the garden 1 or 2 days a week. Just as vicious cycles can make us spiral downwards in mood, so virtuous cycles can start the process of a lift in mood. Once Maya manages this first step, she feels slightly brighter. There is a slight stirring of pleasure from being outside, hearing the birds. It's enough, once she's done this a couple of times in a week, to make her feel like it might be worth bothering to have a shower. In turn, having a shower makes her feel much more like herself. Starting small and trying to savour activities and appreciate herself for doing them is the first bit of coming out of the slump. Part of therapy can be about helping people to identify and work towards goals which will help them to feel less bleak. Part of it can also be helping people to spot pleasurable moments. Something I often ask people to do is to use a notebook to keep track each day of one thing they enjoy and one thing they feel proud of. Keeping track in this way helps us to notice things and help that virtuous cycle to get started. It's common to feel like you have to wait until you feel like doing this, but in fact, sometimes we don't feel like doing the thing until we've begun to do it. Fear and anxiety are also very effective at freezing us in our tracks. When we're scared by something, it's only natural to stop and try to work out what is the safest thing to do. The trouble is that sometimes the fears and worries we have keep us locked in ways of behaving which limit us. Having some knowledge about how anxiety is related to avoidance can help us to keep going even when things feel scary. In therapy, I might work with someone to draw out a ladder or a mountain of fears, with escalating anxieties placed nearer the top and smaller worries at the bottom. Whereas in old-school therapeutic approaches, people were encouraged to flood themselves by exposing themselves to their greatest fear straight away, it's now much more usual to pick a smaller fear first and gradually work up the ladder or mountain at a pace you feel comfy with. There are now virtual reality programs which can help with graded exposure, like one which helps people with a fear of heights expose themselves to higher and higher floors in a virtual shopping centre, and another which helps army veterans with post-traumatic reactions expose themselves to virtual combat scenarios safely. Maya has been avoiding going to social events because she feels so anxious about how things will be when she's there. The more she avoids parties or invitations to spend time with friends, the more isolated and anxious she feels. Once she begins to build up socialising, step by small step, starting with a coffee with a friend she feels comfortable with, she realises that her anxiety about the situation usually comes down within about 20 minutes. She recognises the feeling of fear, but she's able to go to a party anyway, and she notices that the more she goes to gatherings, the better she feels about them. Realising that what we do can change how we feel is a powerful tool to have in our repertoire. It means we can do something in order to feel like we want to do it. In the bleaker, wintry months, it can feel difficult to remember what our sense of purpose is about. Acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, has a lot to say about finding our direction. It concentrates on values, the underlying things we want to move towards in our lives. If health is something I hold dear, when I'm feeling like all I want to do is eat cake, remembering my values might help me to mix it up and add some fruit and veggies in. Remembering values is really thinking about how we want to live our lives, trying to act with intention. It's worth trying hard to keep our eyes on what we are doing rather than comparing ourselves with everyone around us. I remember a phase in my 30s when I was living in London where I felt like I'd suddenly looked around and realised that most of my friends had got married and had children. The thought of settling down at that point felt claustrophobic to me. It didn't stop me feeling like maybe I was behind the curve somehow. Looking back now, I feel I was just doing things at my own pace. It's worth trying to notice how you feel before and after using social media. Do you find yourself feeling energised and motivated, or do you find yourself feeling envious and depressed? It's draining to compare yourself to others. There will always be someone doing better than you. There will also always be someone doing worse than you, but we don't tend to pick those people to hold ourselves up against. In real life, face to face, it's more possible to see the nuances of what someone might be experiencing. But even face to face, we can miss stuff, particularly if we're already predisposed to find ourselves lacking. It's not the social media itself or the hanging out with friends that is positive or negative. It's the way we choose to use social media or the way we compare ourselves with people around us. If you find yourself constantly comparing yourself to a colleague in a way that makes you feel bad, can you try to identify what it is that you feel envious of and try to take positive steps towards that thing yourself? Changing our way of approaching how we compare ourselves with others might also make us realise that we're just doing something different and not necessarily something worse. Maybe we're not as stuck as we feel. A Year to Change Your Mind, Episode 3, by me, Dr. Lucy Maddox. This month, how our environment can affect our health. March. There's a lot of talk in spring about cleaning, Marie Kondoing our living spaces, and generally decluttering. The idea of a beautifully organised space where everything has its place and everything has a reason for being there is calming. Perhaps what we're doing in pruning back our stuff is trying to clear away the thoughts that skitter about and don't settle, to make space for a more essential version of ourselves who can respond consciously instead of reacting with a knee-jerk to things flying at us from all directions. It's hard to declutter though. Anyone who's ever tried to rationalise their stuff will know how likely it is that after an hour of emptying drawers, you'll be left surrounded by mess, not knowing quite how to get out of it. Is it even worth it? What do we really know about how the environments we spend our time in can influence our health and well-being? There is good evidence that our surroundings matter, both psychologically and physically. Our external environments often reflect our internal headspaces, and shifting what's on the outside can help to change the inside feelings too. When people enter a therapy room, they often come with a sense of chaos and a lack of control or safety. Ideally, the therapy room and the therapist can help someone to reclaim a sense of feeling contained and held in a calm, safe space. My first job as a newly qualified clinical psychologist was working at the Bethlem Hospital, which is based in Beckenham in Kent. Bethlem is one of the oldest mental health hospitals and is where the word Bedlam comes from. The site where Bethlem is now has a large footprint with a lot of green space, flower beds, an art gallery and a wide open field. The wards were often noisy, and the atmosphere could feel unpredictable. But the grounds outside were a good place to go for a walk with young people staying on the ward. They gave a sense of space and freedom, an antidote to being cooped up inside. Much of what we can learn about the effect of the environment on how we feel comes from research into hospital settings. Roger Ulrich, Professor of Architecture at Chalmers University of Technology in Sweden, was one of the first to research how hospital buildings can affect patients. In 1984, he took advantage of a hospital ward with a long corridor to conduct an experiment. In the corridor, half the patients had a view of a brick wall and half had a view of trees. The patients with the view outside got better more rapidly and experienced less pain than those facing the wall, asking for fewer painkillers and reporting fewer minor complications like headaches or sickness. Reducing stress and distracting patients from their internal focus or their obsession on their own pain reduces the pain, says Ulrich. There are some studies suggesting that our brain activity changes in response to a natural environment, with nature having a restorative effect. Natural environments and pleasant sensory experiences trigger low-frequency rhythms in our frontal lobes, which are associated with lower stress and higher relaxation. Studies that measure our brain's electrical activity and blood flow show this again and again. What's outside does change what's going on inside. Using natural materials like wood and having plants growing in a space can also bring nature indoors, as many people noticed when the lockdowns in response to COVID-19 prompted sales of houseplants. The Wellcome Trust offices in London do this by having trees growing inside their atrium. You might have heard of the practice of forest bathing from Japan, which involves spending time in the woods and really paying attention to the sensations you experience there. Wellcome have literally brought a small wood into their building. Scandinavian countries have a history of being good at bringing aspects of nature inside. I travelled to Norway several years ago to report for the online long-form magazine Mosaic on an award-winning hospital. Coming into land on the aeroplane, I watched the landscape of Oslo get nearer. The colours are soothing, the dark blue-greens of trees, the blue-black of the water, the misty blue-greys of the mountains receding into the far distance. This is a country where nature is all around you. Oslo's Akershus Hospital, completed in 2008, won the coveted Better Building Healthcare Award for Best International Design in 2009. And is widely recognised as an excellent example of health-promoting architecture. In contrast to its backdrop of fir trees and hills, the hospital looks imposingly modern, all white with straight lines. As you follow the path round the main doors, piano music pipes out of embedded speakers. Inside, pale wood is everywhere. To the left are some cosy lamps attached to wooden sofa-shaped benches. Architect Anne Underhaug from C.F. Muller was involved in the team designing the hospital. For her, the wood is not a consequence of the research on its health-promoting value, but more of the experience of living in Scandinavia. "Have you seen the houses in Norway?" she laughed as she showed me around. "We build everything out of wood." As you enter the hospital, it feels modern, quiet, and very light. If you walk a few metres further in, the ceiling suddenly opens up even more, stretching up several stories and drawing the eye towards the sky, which is visible through the huge glass roof. Bridge-like open corridors traverse the atrium, connecting one side of the hospital to the other. Daylight means a lot in Scandinavia because half the year you don't have very much, explains Underhaug. Regulations are very strict on daylight in Scandinavia. Here the operating theatres have windows in as well. Everything, says Underhaug. Even the X-ray rooms and CT rooms, MRI rooms, all of them have daylight. People need to look out, they need the daylight. You don't need a book on evidence-based design to know that. In the southwest of England, in the picturesque Georgian city of Bath, The Royal United Hospital has a very modern intensive care unit for babies, or NICU. Laura got to know this unit well in the summer that she gave birth to twins 5 weeks early. Her baby girls were looked after in the Dyson Centre for Neonatal Care. Laura arrived there after a caesarean section, having lost more blood than expected. She remembers being wheeled through the double doors of the centre for the first time. I do remember the light just really hitting me. The Dyson Centre is light, airy and spacious. Natural wood and soothing greens make it feel more like a spa than part of a hospital. You're greeted by a wooden reception desk, and to the left, French windows open onto a zen-like pebble garden. A central corridor loops round in a horseshoe shape with smaller rooms coming off it. The ceiling of the corridor is high, with skylights running its whole length, clouds and blue visible throughout. The upper walls are painted moss green. The floor below is a sandstone colour, and the walls and the ceiling beams are whitewashed wood. Finished in 2011, the Dyson Centre purposefully distanced itself from the traditional hospital look, feel and smell. When they investigated the impact of the newly designed building, clinical researchers devised new and ingenious ways of measuring the activity of babies. Special baby accelerometers were fixed onto their nappies to monitor the baby's breathing patterns. Results were impressive. 10 families using the old unit and 10 families using the new centre took part in the research, along with over 40 staff members. Staff in the new centre spent nearly twice as much time in clinical rooms with the babies as the staff in the old unit did. Parents visited the new centre for an average of 30 minutes longer a day. Some 90% of babies observed in the new centre were breastfed, compared with 64% of those studied in the old unit. The new environment increased visiting, reduced patient stress, and sped up recovery. The new centre is 8 decibels quieter than the old NICU, and the babies studied in the new centre slept for 20% longer than those in the old unit. Sleep is crucial for premature babies' brain development, so making baby wards quieter makes total sense. Some of us are more sensitive to sensory information than others. Misophonia is where certain sounds cause people huge distress, to an extent which others might find disproportionate. Some might find it intolerable to be in a crowd of people all making a noise, especially in places where sound can bounce around high ceilings and reflective surfaces. We're still finding out why some people are more sensitive to noise and other sensory stimulation than others. One indicator of autism spectrum condition is increased sensory sensitivity across any of the senses. For example, finding labels in clothes unbearable, finding loud noises distressing, and finding strong smells unpleasant. Sensory processing sensitivity is a separate diagnosis. Being extra sensitive in this way has been linked to being more introvert, but this might be because sensory stimulation tends to come along with other people. I think we can all show introvert and extrovert traits. Perhaps more practically helpful is considering how to manage different levels of sensory sensitivity. If you find background noise very distracting, but you share a workspace with someone who loves to have the radio on 24/7, that's going to be stressful. It feels intuitively right that low noise, natural light, and natural views are good for us. But to understand why, we need to know more about the biology of our bodies. There are 3 main systems in the body that are involved in maintaining health: the nervous system, the hormone or endocrine system, and the immune system. These are in a triangle of communication, each interacting with the others. A healing environment is one which has a calming effect on the central nervous system. Cutting down excitatory and stressful stimuli like loud noise, bright light, and threatening colours will reduce the likelihood of the stress hormone systems being triggered. Cortisol, adrenaline, and noradrenaline, or epinephrine, activate organs and tissues, including our lungs, heart, and skeletal muscles, getting us ready to either fight or flee from the immediate threat. At the same time, these stress hormones suppress other systems in the body, such as sex hormones, growth hormones, thyroid hormones, and also the immune system. Whenever we're stressed out, our immune system is being compromised. People whose everyday jobs keep piling on the pressure are especially vulnerable to chronic stress. Those such as combat soldiers, firefighters, air traffic controllers, police officers, and A&E staff. Lots of jobs involve making decisions which are stressful. Hospital staff working in acute settings, or people making decisions about large sums of money on the trading floor, all have to be alert enough to make quick decisions based on the information available. It might be tempting to think that we need some level of stress in these environments to help decisions to be fast-paced. But actually, higher levels of stress usually lead to worse decisions. We tend to rely more on automatic thinking styles, which can be biased, rather than higher-level cognitive processes. So there's a case for making the stock market trading floor more relaxing too. The idea of creating an environment which allows our nervous system to feel soothed is one which threads through many environments. This is something the Dyson NICU designers thought about. Looking at the original sketches for the unit, one of them stands out. The architect has drawn the building like a hug, its arms enveloping a baby. The architecture was inspired by literature from attachment theory, which explains how, as infants, we attach to our primary caregivers, using them as a secure base from which to explore the world. The building was built to be like a great big caregiver, providing a place of safety for infants and families. A Year to Change Your Mind, Episode 4, by me, Dr. Lucy Maddox. This month, how we can stop having a go at ourselves and encourage ourselves to bloom. April. My mum has a cherry tree in her garden, and in April its pink blossoms seem to appear out of nowhere. We realise that things have been changing all along. The seasons have been shifting under the cover of winter, and now it's suddenly obvious that things are not the same. This sense of things alive around us, flourishing and growing, can bring us a sense of energy and purpose, but only if we're nourishing ourselves as much as we would a plant we were tending. Some of how we nourish ourselves might be the basics: sleep, eating well, doing exercise. Some of how we nourish ourselves might be in what we choose to make the time for: creative pursuits, simple pleasures, a moment of stillness. And some of how we nourish ourselves might be in how we choose to speak to ourselves. A large number of our daily thoughts involve talking to ourselves. Our inner chat is just as important as the chat we have with other people, and it's more in our control than we might think. How do you tend to speak to yourself or about yourself? Usually, we speak more harshly to ourselves and about ourselves than we do to others. It's very hard to flourish and grow if we're undermining ourselves at every turn. Sometimes it's clear that what we say to ourselves in our heads is something we've learnt elsewhere. This could be from our upbringing, our social environment, or from some previous experience. If we grew up hearing criticism from others, we might have learnt to get in there first. Although it's tempting to think that criticising ourselves means we avoid making mistakes, it often makes us feel less certain of ourselves and doesn't necessarily improve our performance. It's not just a case of habit. As children, we develop schemas to make sense of the world and other people around us. Whatever the source of the critical inner monologue, we can tackle it using some reliable techniques. CBT suggests that actively seeking to change our thoughts can result in changes in our emotional landscape and physical well-being. Some of what CBT involves is catching thoughts that crop up and trying to evaluate them dispassionately rather than taking them at face value. For example, consider Libby. She has a recurring thought that people won't like me if they really get to know me, a belief which hobbles her efforts to get close to others. Taking a moment to really evaluate the evidence for this might give rise to a mix of different possibilities. There might be an example of a romantic relationship ending after some time, and Libby might have attributed this to her letting her guard down. However, really looking at evidence for the other side as well, Libby concedes that she has had other relationships in which she's been herself which haven't ended, with her friends, with her sister, and another romance which she chose to end, not them. Thinking about it, the best relationships she has are those in which she is more herself, not less. Sometimes the stories in our heads can become self-fulfilling prophecies. If we see ourselves as a failure, or lazy, or rubbish with relationships, then we're more likely to behave in that way, or to avoid experiences which might prove us wrong. We're also likely to disregard evidence to the contrary, so we have to actively work at looking for evidence for the other point of view. If our inner voice is beating ourselves up about how we've just handled a situation, we're less likely to seek out more opportunities to handle something similar. If, in relationships, like Libby, the way we make sense of a breakup is to blame ourselves and tell ourselves we're rubbish at going out with people, then we'll approach the next relationship in a less sure way. With jobs too, if we tell ourselves that we left a job because we couldn't do it, we're more likely to suffer from low confidence. If instead we can see it as not a good fit for us, or if we're able to spot the things we did do well, then we're more likely to be able to step into the next job with a sense of competence. Being able to clock a perspective or way of talking to ourselves which could be potentially unhelpful and untrue is a big first step to sorting it out. Then we can check if the evidence supports it, consider whether alternative points of view might be available, and work hard on strengthening those new thoughts. Jumping to conclusions is a style of thinking which is sometimes targeted in talking therapies for psychosis. Psychosis is an umbrella term for a loss of contact with reality and can encompass hearing voices, seeing things that other people can't see, and experiencing delusional ideas about the world, including paranoia. Jumping to conclusions is associated with belief in delusional ideas. When a strongly held belief is interfering with how someone lives their life, it can be debilitating to relationships and to opportunities that are available. We all jump to conclusions about things every day, but if those conclusions are wildly different from the way that other people are experiencing the world, it can put us at odds with them. Let's think about Toby. He experiences a sense of paranoia. He feels sure that others are out to get him, and in particular, he thinks the TV often has messages in it that are targeted directly at him. Therapy for Toby might include thinking about a range of different explanations for his experiences and then evaluating the evidence for and against each one, and seeing if this slightly shifts Toby's certainty about the beliefs he has. Toby might feel a sense of distrust for his mental health team because he thinks they've been talking to him through the TV. Only by digging into the reasons for this belief would we discover together that his community mental health nurse had been on the local news talking about mental health. No wonder it had felt personal and startling. Even without psychosis, we're all prone to jumping to conclusions about ourselves, the world around us, and the other people in it, and about what's going to happen next. To take an oversimplified example, if I think that I'm a horrible person and that everyone is likely to be nasty to me, I'll probably approach relationships with others in a more defensive way, which might make it harder to connect. This is totally understandable and very unhelpful at the same time. A question which can help us to see things from a different perspective is to ask, what would you say to a good friend? We are much more likely to tell a friend that they're managing well in challenging times. Directing a compassionate attitude towards ourselves can feel harder. One researcher who spent most of her career investigating self-compassion is Kristin Neff. She characterises self-compassion using 3 main elements. The first is self-kindness instead of self-judgment. We all mess up sometimes. Instead of having a go at ourselves about this, self-compassion would have us being as kind to ourselves as we would be to a loved one. If we can hold ourselves with the same kindness, we can help to take the added layer of being nasty to ourselves away from the difficult situation of being disappointed in ourselves anyway. The second element is a sense of common humanity instead of isolation. Self-compassion recognises that we all mess up sometimes, and we all suffer sometimes. When we feel pain and sadness, it's easy to feel like we're the only one in the world feeling this bad. Common humanity is the recognition that suffering and inadequacy is part of the human condition. Kristin Neff's third element of self-compassion is mindfulness instead of over-identification. This refers to being able to pay attention to our feelings, negative as well as positive, and allow them to be, without trying either to suppress them or to get caught up in them. If we can recognise that sad or fearful feelings are there and hold that recognition with empathy for ourselves, then we're less likely to torture ourselves with ways of thinking or behaving which can end up being actively unhelpful. Externalising a critical inner voice by visualising it as someone separate from ourselves can help to make it feel further removed from us and less powerful. If we can separate this unhelpful inner voice from ourselves, we can refer to it as different from ourselves. We also tell ourselves stories to make sense of who we are in the world. Stories are one of the great pleasures of being human. The sense of greater meaning we get from being fully absorbed in a good story can help us learn about other viewpoints. Some of the stories we tell are small scraps, making sense of a behaviour or an experience as it happens. I might make sense of one thing one way and then change my mind about how I see it once I learn something new. These are sometimes the moments when something shifts, like a kaleidoscope changing position, and we see things differently. This sort of step change moment is when we update our framework for understanding the world in the light of new information. Stories are powerful. It's no surprise that aspects of storytelling can be found in lots of types of psychotherapy. In narrative therapy, stories are seen as the connecting lines between the dots of events. The exact same events can be made sense of in radically different ways, just as the same dots on a piece of paper could be connected in different patterns. If the same things can happen but can be described in different ways by different narratives, then it's up to us what we choose to prioritise in the story. Although part of what narrative therapy acknowledges is that it's hard to do this sometimes. Sometimes we need help to see that there are other ways of telling it. The events that we tend to notice also tend to fit with the narrative we have. We might not even notice some events if they don't fit with our current story. Take Kimmy, for example. She's convinced that she's not good enough at the art and design course she's studying. She compares herself unfavourably to her friends. When she does get a good mark, she sees it as a fluke, and she remembers the times she's done less well than she wanted to, much more easily than the times when she felt pleased about what she'd created. The story she tells herself is that she's struggling and doing less well than other people. Now imagine Kimmy again. This time she has a slightly different story. She places more emphasis on how she feels when she's painting and drawing. She sees the times when she gets a less good mark as an opportunity to learn, and thinks sometimes she gets a worse mark just before she gets a better score because she's experimented and learnt something. She remembers too that the thing she didn't do as well on was a piece of work she did in the middle of having flu, and she allows herself to recognise that this might have affected her mark. She thinks about how much she's enjoying the course and how she would like to carry on learning, and this makes her consider the option of further study. The same things have happened, but the dots have been joined up in a different way. We have more control over our inner narrative than we think we do. Coaxing yours into even a 1% more nourishing voice than it is now is meaningful. It's worth spending some time with this. the rewards can be big. A Year to Change Your Mind, Episode 5, by me, Dr. Lucy Maddox. This month, the art of talking and listening, and how to have a constructive row. May. In Celtic traditions, May is the month of Beltane, Gaelic May Day. This festival is halfway between the spring and summer equinoxes. Beltane roughly translates as bright fire, and burning Beltane bonfires and dancing into the early hours are traditional ways to celebrate the return of summer. The promise of summer brings with it a sense of unfurling, coming out into the light and beginning to interact with each other more. With this increased possibility of connection, what can psychology teach us about the art of talking and listening? Trainee therapists are taught a lot about the art of listening and talking. I trained at University College London, and in the first month they taught us the therapy basics. We practiced with actors behind a one-way mirror so that a group of our peers and a tutor could watch our sweaty attempts at first-time therapy and give us feedback afterwards. At the start of training, I remember feeling tied up in conversational knots in the pub as a side effect of weeks spent analysing what we said and how we said it. Talking therapies use many skills, and some of these conversational techniques can be useful in non-therapy conversations too. Being able to understand what someone else needs or wants, and to express what you need or want, is no small skill. Connecting, feeling like we're all in this together, is what it's all about. It's much easier to listen when your own voice doesn't feel unheard. One of the special things about a therapy session is the undivided attention you get. Your therapist won't be scrolling through their phone while they chat to you. Being fully present in the moment and really giving someone else your attention is a powerful signal to them that they matter to you. The sorts of questions that we ask someone can have a big effect on how they answer us. Are you all right? Is a closed question. It's answered by a binary yes or no. How are you feeling today? Is an open question. It invites more of a response and makes it more likely that we'll discover something. Tell me about how you are is perhaps even more of an invitation, as it steps away from the usual conversational pattern that we all get into. How are you? Fine. And you? Fine. When someone asks how we are in day-to-day life, we often read it as a general, polite expression of care, rather than a genuine question about how we're doing. Asking questions is also important in itself. If no one asks anything, it's easy to assume they're just not interested, as anyone who's been on a date with someone who's forgotten to ask questions will tell you. I think there's something about dating in particular where the pressure and expectation can add to the stiltedness of conversation, as if you're both interviewing for a job which you're not even sure you want. Another technique that's used a lot in therapy is called active listening. This involves summarising back what someone has said in their own words to help them feel really heard. At first, this can make you feel like a bit of a parrot, but it's a surprisingly powerful tool. As Carl Rogers and Richard Farson, early proponents of active listening, wrote, when people are listened to sensitively, they tend to listen to themselves with more care and to make clear exactly what they're feeling and thinking. Active listening also stops you from firing off your own ideas about solutions too quickly, or jumping into offering your perspective on something before you've made sure you've heard the other person properly. Sometimes in therapy sessions, I might be trying to rein a conversation in. Sometimes, especially if people are anxious and repeating the same unhelpful thing over and over, it can feel important to interrupt. With only about an hour for a therapy session, I want it to be a useful hour that someone comes away from feeling like it's been worthwhile. Repeating back what someone has said not only helps me to check I've understood it correctly, but also can help to get my voice in, and then move from hearing what someone has said to building on it and offering new ideas. Sometimes therapy sessions involve thinking about the way that the person coming for therapy is talking with other people. In particular, being assertive in conversations is something that can often crop up. Being assertive, as opposed to aggressive or passive, is useful to learn. Learning to express ourselves clearly, to calmly repeat what we need others to hear, and to take the risk of not being liked for it, can help us to get our needs met while being fair, both to ourselves and the other person. Assertiveness training goes back a long way and was particularly popular in the 1970s and 1980s, but is still used today as part of some types of therapy. Assertive behaviour is any action that reflects someone's own best interest, but without trampling on the interests of others. Joseph Volpe and Arnold Lazarus studied assertiveness in the early 1960s and came up with 4 main components: the ability to openly communicate about our own desires and needs, to talk about our positive and negative feelings, to say no, and to establish contact and begin, maintain and end conversations. Assertiveness is not only about what we say, but also about how we say it. If I think I'm being assertive by saying how I feel about something, but do it in such a quiet and questioning tone of voice that it sounds like I'm unsure, and if I do it with a very protective body posture, arms wrapped around me and shoulders hunched, then I'm much more likely to be perceived as unlikely to stand my ground. Sometimes expressing our own wants and needs can be hard because of other experiences we've had where we've been unheard or shut down. The risk associated with continually squashing down what we want or need is that if we do it enough, we can sometimes end up not even knowing what it is that we would like because we can't tune into it. Assertiveness training often encourages us to own our feelings and opinions more, to use I statements such as I feel worried or I feel unsure, and to clearly state what we want. Thank you, but I don't want to come to that party this weekend. We can use empathic assertion and acknowledge the other person's situation first. I know you're really busy at the moment, but I feel sad when we have to keep rearranging our meetup. What is a good row? We might have different ideas about this depending on the templates we have from other experiences of conflict. I used to be very conflict averse. I'd do a lot to avoid having an argument, even if it meant squashing down my own needs to some extent. With time, I've come to see that in some senses conflict can be productive. Part of that feeling has probably come from working in wards. Mental health ward teams for teenagers involve many different professionals. Everyone has their own different type of training in how to help. On the wards I worked on, there was a regular ward round meeting that allowed everyone to discuss how things were going for each young person. People didn't always agree on what the best next step was, but ward rounds didn't involve screaming rows. They involved robust discussion sometimes, but all within a framework of everyone wanting the best for the young person who's being discussed. They involved joint problem solving. Closer to home, conflict is also sometimes necessary. How do people close to us know that something they've done or said has had a negative effect on us? If we're lucky, they might notice or guess, but it's hard to be a mind reader. It's more likely that we might need to say, and this can risk conflict. In effective conflict management, everyone is active in trying to problem solve, and everyone takes turns to listen and to speak. Sometimes different people will have different styles of conflict management, and this might result in a pattern such as demand-withdraw, where one person is trying to talk about the problem and the other person withdraws. This can often lead to one person feeling frustrated and another feeling attacked. Let's think about Meg and her teenage son Ben. Meg wants to know what's going on with Ben, what he's been doing. Ben increasingly wants the independence that is usual for a teenager to crave. In response to Meg's escalating questions about what he's been doing, Ben shuts down further and further, offering little but monosyllabic replies. Meg feels like she's constantly nagging at Ben to let her into his life, and Ben is constantly feeling like he has to take himself away in order to get some space. The two often end up having a row where Meg is saying the same things repeatedly and Ben is saying nothing but then storms off. Ben is going to see a therapist, and in one session his mum joins. Talking things through together with the therapist, the two can agree on what the pattern of their relationship is. By seeing it as something they can talk about as separate to themselves, they're also able to come up with some ideas for what might help. Meg offers to ask fewer questions, especially when Ben has just come in the door, and Ben offers to try to let Meg know a little bit more about what's going on for him. Being able to identify specific examples of what's bothering you is also much more helpful than a vague, "you always make me feel bad." Remembering that conflict can be positive if it's handled sensitively instead of aggressively can help too. Conflict can result in creative solutions. Assertiveness can also help us to manage criticism and compliments. Being able to properly hear criticism and respond to it calmly and not defensively is useful, as is being able to accept a compliment without doing ourselves down. Another lesson from conversations in therapy is that of leaving space. When I was training, I remember finding it excruciating to leave a pause before asking another question. It's so important to leave that bit of space though, as more often than not, someone will continue with an answer that they didn't even know that they were thinking. In today's world of multiple social media platforms, we're spoilt for choice for different ways to communicate. There's no rule to say that one form of communication is better. What we lose in body language and the micro-expressions of face-to-face contact, we can maybe make up for in the frankness that can come from a written conversation. Talking when we're walking or sitting side by side in a car can embolden us to say more than we might if we were sitting opposite each other, eyes locked. An exercise that often gets used in couples therapy encourages people in romantic partnerships to really sit and listen to the other one before they go on to say what they want to say themselves. All too often in a partnership, we can end up both trying to make ourselves heard at the expense of listening to the other. In a world where opinions can often end up being polarised into extremes, and social media platforms don't always encourage nuanced listening, taking steps to really hear what other people are saying and trying to find some value in other views can feel like a radical act. As May's sunshine coaxes us to gently unfurl from our winter cocoon, we might be left with the pleasant feeling of facing outwards and beginning to reach for each other. A Year to Change Your Mind, Episode 6, by me, Dr. Lucy Maddox. This month, social anxiety and how to feel more connected to one another. June. With June, we're properly into summer, and this season often brings with it more opportunities to be social as the extra hours stretch on and we have more time to meet people. With all the conversational gambits in the world, it can still sometimes feel hard to properly connect with people. One obstacle is social anxiety. Particularly in the aftermath of the lockdowns and social withdrawal that we've all been through in the last few years, any kind of socialising might lead us to feel an awkwardness or sense of worry. Approximately 1 in 10 people are affected by social anxiety. This problem often starts in adolescence, but can carry on into adulthood and massively affect what people feel able to do. Imagine feeling so consumed with worry about what other people are thinking of you that any times you do venture out to a social gathering or a work meeting, your thoughts are filled with how you think others must be seeing you. They must be thinking you're boring or stupid or ugly or worse. Social anxiety traps us. We are there but not really there, too busy in our own minds running over the many ways we're falling short, which means we're not fully ourselves. It's no coincidence that social anxiety is often heightened in adolescence, a time when our brains are primed to be highly sensitive to social cues from our peer group. As we get older and establish more what we like, the opinions of others hopefully become less important. But for any of us at any age, it's possible to be catapulted back to that uncomfortable sensation of being the uncool one at school. Treatment of social anxiety is similar to treatment for any anxiety problem, in that it involves doing the opposite of what makes us feel at ease. In this case, that means going into more social situations, and crucially, looking around to evaluate people's reaction to us instead of jumping to conclusions about what others are thinking. The trick is to try to shift our attention to other people, so we can be open to really seeing how they're reacting, and so that we end up getting absorbed in what they're saying rather than stuck in our own head. I used to blush really badly in my early to mid-20s. Blushing happens as an unconscious reaction to that fight or flight response that we get when we're feeling stressed or under threat. It's our sympathetic nervous system in action, telling our blood vessels to dilate and allow blood to pump faster. Similar to other manifestations of social anxiety, blushing tends to provoke loops of thinking where the focus is very much on yourself. You blush, you have some unhelpful thoughts about the blush, and these sorts of thoughts often cause us to withdraw socially. This withdrawal means we get stuck again in self-focus, just paying attention to ourselves. We can get caught up in a negative spiral of how we're sure that other people think we're boring or rubbish or stupid. These thoughts tend to lead to us looking for evidence to support them, so we read people's facial expressions more easily as bored or judgmental, when actually they may just be tired or thoughtful. If instead we can turn our attention outwards, we might be surprised how little attention is being paid to the blush. Taking the focus off ourselves and genuinely tuning in with those around us helps to move us on from the anxious loop we can get stuck in. Most people are usually thinking about their own dilemmas and are very unlikely to be thinking about us. Making the effort to switch our attention from an internal focus on ourselves to an external focus on other people can really help. Developmental psychology has a lot to say about relationships and how we learn about them. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby in the 1950s and further added to by Mary Ainsworth in the 1970s, outlines the need for children to have a secure base from which they can explore. Reliable, consistently loving parenting sets them up well for future relationships with the world. There are different types of attachment relationship that children form with their primary caregiver, and these might influence the way we go on to approach relationships with other people. The main types of attachment relationship, originally categorised by Mary Ainsworth, are the insecure avoidant, insecure ambivalent, and the secure. In a specific sequence of events, called the strange situation, Ainsworth observed how infants responded when their caregiver left the room and returned, and when a stranger entered the room and left. Infants who were securely attached got upset when their caregiver left, and were comforted when they returned. Insecure avoidant infants seemed not to notice their caregiver leaving, but heart rate monitors revealed that the babies were actually stressed, just not showing it. Insecure ambivalent children seemed clingy before the caregiver left, and then found it hard to settle afterwards. Although secure attachment obviously sounds much better than the others, most people are not securely attached, and this doesn't mean anything bad. The only category of attachment which is more worrying is one that was added later by a researcher called Mary Main. This fourth category is called disorganised attachment. Mary Main drew attention to the difficulty which children experience when they have a caregiver who is looking after them but also hurting them. In the strange situation experiment, disorganised attachment is shown by much less predictable responses to a caregiver arriving or leaving. Sometimes these infants freeze and seem unsure whether to approach or retreat from their caregiver. Children who've experienced abuse or neglect have an impossible push-pull situation where they're trying to seek safety with the person who's also the source of danger. This can profoundly affect relationships later on, making it harder to trust that getting close to someone else will be safe. Although evidence shows that even one secure relationship with a caring adult can make all the difference in allowing children to develop into young adults who are able to negotiate relationships and the world around them. When we come across others in our adult lives who seem to fit into a role we recognise, it can feel comfortable to fall into a familiar pattern of relating to that person. Let's consider Carrie. Carrie's feeling low and trying her best to manage it, but there's a lot going on with her wider networks that's impacting on how she feels. Her relationship with her dad is difficult. He needs a lot from her, and they're close, but he can be cruel on occasion. Carrie experiences some similar struggles in her romantic partnership and with one of her close friends, where she finds it impossible to prioritise her own needs above theirs. Carrie holds herself to extremely high standards and berates herself for being a selfish person when she doesn't meet the needs of everyone around her. It's incredibly hard to start doing things differently when you have a long pattern of behaving in a certain way with other people. For all that it can feel horrible to be in a position where you feel put upon, taking the step to work out what you need and tell someone else about it can feel exhausting and scary. Checking out what we've said or done with a trusted other can help us to work out if our feelings are reasonable and proportionate, or if they may be amplified. Whether this person is a close friend or a therapist, some way of getting a degree of extra perspective can be helpful. Carrie took steps to experiment with new ways of being, little by little, and it gradually got easier. Saying no, nicely but firmly, to prioritising others over herself at all times meant she gradually had a taste of knowing what she wanted and getting it. I think familiar patterns repeating in romantic relationships are why people joke about going for a man like your dad or a woman like your mum. Freudian theory aside, it's not surprising, is it, that we would recognise and find comfort in people who remind us in some way of our first caregivers. Friendships can feel just as intense as romantic relationships, and sometimes the same sorts of familiar patterns can get enacted with friends as with lovers. Friendships are so important to our sense of who we are. If we're lucky, they're some of the most long-lasting relationships of our lives, outliving the more volatile romances. The relationship we have with a therapist can be a useful place to practice doing things differently. In psychological therapy sessions, it's almost inevitable that I will misunderstand or get something wrong at some point. This idea that we all get things wrong in conversations and relationships cuts across several schools of therapy. The concept of rupture and repair in therapy relationships gives space to the importance of being able to mess up and then work to overcome that mess. Being able to do this in therapy means you're able to practice this for the real world too, and it's so incredibly valuable to be able to tell someone when they've hurt your feelings or misunderstood. In a type of therapy called mentalization-based treatment, or MBT, this is made very explicit, with the therapist expecting to get things wrong and asking the client to tell them when they do. MBT starts from the perspective that it's impossible for us to know what is in each other's minds, and the recognition that it can be painful to feel misunderstood. Practitioners in MBT work hard to make sure they're not guessing what someone else is feeling. So therapists frequently check in to be sure they understand what the client is meaning, and also that the client is understanding what the therapist is trying to convey. It can feel tough to do this in a friendship. How often does someone hurt our feelings, and yet we tell everyone else except them about it? If we're consistently spending time with someone who makes us feel less happy or less confident, then maybe it's a friendship in which our needs have fallen out of sync. Friendships can cycle through periods of greater or less intensity. We might fall out of step for a while. It doesn't mean the friendship's necessarily lost. In these times, I think it can help to have the idea of holding the relationship lightly. Perhaps it's like the tide, drawing away and coming back at its own pace. Sometimes it might not come back with the same intensity as before. It's painful, of course, to be on the reverse end of that. If you get the sense that a friend you're holding dear is finding the relationship less fulfilling. Sometimes someone might have their own reason for withdrawing from a relationship, and there's not always anything we can do about that, except to try to be grateful for the relationship that was. In the light and heat of the summer months, I wonder if the promise of a new party and a new person we might meet there is also the promise of the opportunity to be a fresh version of ourselves, sparklier, more interesting, more charming. With all relationships, we are the common factor, and we will always end up face to face with ourselves at some point within them. Ideally, we'll be able to balance being able to hold some attention on the outside world, on what people are really saying or doing, so that we don't overthink things in our own head, and also to have some attention on looking after ourselves in all ways. By balancing the energy we put both into friendships with others and our relationship with ourselves, we hopefully can feel a good connection with both. A Year to Change Your Mind, Episode 7, by me, Dr. Lucy Maddox. This month, how to help manage uncertainty and existential dread. July. July has always been a hotter month in the UK, but in recent years the heat of the summer months has ramped right up, as it has in many other countries. More and more, the expected weather that a certain month is traditionally associated with is less easy to predict. Leaves falling in summer, unexpectedly intense heat waves. My friend Chris and I both tend to wake up with worries at 3 a.m. in the morning, and we're no stranger to those spirals of thought which seem so real in the dark early hours. We've all had plenty of existential threats in the last few years. The climate emergency, the COVID-19 pandemic, on top of the usual existential dread which can appear for no real reason in the early hours. The good news is that there are things we can do to manage existential dread. We might know that it's reasonable to feel scared, but that shouldn't stop us from being able to cope with the threat. We all faced a big threat from 2020 onwards, when coronavirus emerged as a danger worldwide. Researchers measuring the effects of the pandemic in real time found that levels of self-reported anxiety increased in the general population, and that specific groups had even more adverse effects. Frontline staff experienced traumatic reactions to the situations they were regularly facing. Vulnerable groups experienced higher levels of anxiety, and people with pre-existing mental health problems saw these exacerbated. The pandemic meant we were all suddenly living with a great deal of uncertainty. I remember that initial lockdown when the streets fell silent and none of us knew how long it was going to be for. We had to tolerate not knowing, and that is hard. Psychologists have been researching how we tolerate uncertainty for some time pre-pandemic. Uncertainty faces us all the time in life. We don't know what's going to happen next, even though it feels like we do. We don't know when we'll get sick, or die, or win the lottery, or fall in love. We usually carry on fairly obliviously, thinking that one day is likely to be much the same as the one before it, because often it is. Except when it isn't. Existential crises can be global threats like climate change or pandemics, or more personal crises, breakups, job nightmares, or health problems. Everyone finds uncertainty difficult, but people can come to tolerate it. Whether or not we can tolerate uncertainty isn't a fixed personality trait. It gets influenced by other things that are going on in our lives. One of the things which impacts on how well we can tolerate uncertainty is how much we have at stake at the time. In the pandemic, people who were more financially at risk experienced more stress and were more at risk of coping poorly with uncertainty, whereas people with a financial cushion may have still felt stressed, but not to the same degree. Overall, Research has found that intolerance of uncertainty has been increasing in all of us since the 1990s. One hypothesis about the reason behind this is that it's related to the extent to which people have access to the internet and mobile phones. From the 1990s to now, there's been a huge step change in the amount of connectedness we experience and the access to information which we all have. It can feel overwhelming to have too much information and not know what to believe, or it can mean that in situations where it simply isn't possible to know something, we're no longer used to tolerating that not knowingness. This makes me think of how I used to make arrangements in the time before we all had a mobile phone. We used to plan to meet somewhere, and then if someone didn't turn up, we'd wait for them or go on our way, without knowing what had happened until we heard from them or saw them later. Now we all have a direct line in our pocket, so maybe we're a bit less able to sit and wait and not know as a result. It's helpful to recognise that our tolerance for uncertainty has changed over time, because it suggested to the psychologists that there might be some elements of intolerance of uncertainty which we have some control over. Some things that we end up doing as a result, which can get us into a vicious cycle that makes the uncertainty feel worse. In those first mad weeks of the coronavirus pandemic, there was 24/7 coverage of all things coronavirus, and yet also a lot of unknowns. How did it spread? Who was most at risk? During the first UK lockdown, I interviewed Professor Mark Freeston, a researcher who spent much of his career studying how we cope with uncertainty. Mark Freeston has spoken to many people who've been affected by dementia, the progression of which is very unknowable and also very threatening. Some of the things he's learnt from how people cope with this enabled him to advise on what might help any of us cope with any uncertainty. Mark Freeston categorised information into 3 different types: information we need to know, information that might be interesting to know, and information that is unhelpful or counterproductive. So during the peak of COVID-19, we might have needed to know what the rules were that we had to follow, and we might have been interested in knowing the answers to questions about how society was managing the pandemic, and then we might have found unreliable or even malicious information much less helpful. Even the interesting information might be unhelpful in the sense that it might be unknowable and generate more uncertainty. During the later coronavirus lockdowns, I was also pregnant, and this was another strange and liminal time. I read so many books about birth, but ultimately the experience I had was impossible to plan for. And it's uncomfortable to be in a state of uncertainty. It's deeply vulnerable. So what can we do? Especially at times when our consciousness about this uncertainty is highlighted. Mark Freeston's research identifies 2 things. The first is that it helps to really manage our information diet. Where are we getting our information from, and is it helpful or not? What are some of the things that we or other people are doing to help others out? Thinking about this can make it easier for us to manage big global existential events such as pandemics and wars and the effects of the climate crisis too. What local information can we keep track of to help us feel anchored and as if we're making a meaningful difference? We can be selective about our news intake instead of doom scrolling. The second thing that can help is actively looking for information which balances things out. The news gives us information about threat usually. We also need signals that we're safe. So, keep reassuring routines the same, whether that's going for a walk or making sure you do the recycling. This then helps our perception of threat to reduce and our anxiety to go down, which in turn helps us to process the information we do take in more constructively. Individuals who've already experienced trauma or adversity might be extra sensitive to feeling anxious in the face of uncertainty. We might be more on high alert if we've got a backdrop of having to manage a threatening situation before. Trying to read everything there is to read about a worry can be seen as what psychology refers to as a safety behaviour, something we do to try and keep anxiety at bay, but which can end up making it worse. There are plenty of coping strategies we all use that can accidentally make anxiety feel more prominent. From more severe examples like self-harm or over-controlled eating, to more innocuous examples like carrying multiple bottles of antibac just in case we lose one when we're out and about. It's hugely tempting to try to research your way out of an existential worry, but at some point this tends to tip from giving us helpful information to making us feel frantic in our quest for an impossible answer to a question we just can't know yet. What is going to happen next? Let's think about Esme. She's been working in a demanding job for some years, responsible for a school which is due to be inspected by Ofsted, the education body. She's become consumed with worry about the outcome of the report. This began by being motivational. It helped her rally the staff team to prepare. But Esme has no control over when the visit will be, or over several components of the inspection. She finds herself working out who the inspectors are likely to speak to, what time of day they're likely to come. Things that she actually can't possibly know. She skips lunch to work on planning and cancels her out-of-work plans so she can spend more time reading websites where other head teachers discuss how they managed Ofsted inspections. The worry is stopping her sleeping, and she knows this could go on for weeks. With support, Esme takes steps to tackle some of the things which are not productive. She's prepared as best she can, and she's doing the best she can at her job anyway, even without an inspection saying this. She stops reading the websites and makes time to have a proper lunch break. She finds the familiar routines help her to feel a bit more relaxed, and this helps her respond better to difficulties as they arise within the school day. On the day the inspectors do arrive, Esme is in the middle of dealing with a tricky issue, but continues what she's doing instead of dropping everything. She's praised by the inspectors for the way she manages this, and the report is good enough, despite some areas for improvement. Esme gets through these difficult few days, but more importantly, she's realised beforehand that there's a limit to how much she can control how the whole thing goes. Uncertainty is tiring, and so is worrying, so worrying about uncertainty is a double whammy. Life is difficult sometimes. We do face existential messes as we share the planet with each other, and living can bring us face to face with big dilemmas. Another existential threat which we're all facing is the damage that we're doing to the Earth. Worries about the climate crisis have understandably been escalating. Eco-anxiety isn't an official diagnosis, but it's been used by the American Psychological Association in a report about the effects of climate change. If eco-anxiety is feeling unmanageable, we can draw upon the same ideas which help us to tolerate uncertainty. We can choose to look for information from reputable sources and in a conscious, targeted way, rather than having a 24/7 spool of news unravelling about how doomed we all are. We might also try to make sure that we balance time spent thinking about climate change and big existential problems with spending time doing other things that interest us, including staying connected with people we care about. Separating out the things we can control and that we can't control, and choosing to do those controllable things, can then help us to feel a sense of agency. So we can decide to eat less meat, cut out flying, and do what actions we can on a daily basis that contribute to reducing the problem rather than exacerbating it. If things feel hard sometimes, if you feel you've not done enough to tackle the existential worries at hand, you are not alone in that. Just keep going, and know that we're all in this messy old business together, and we're all on this rock of a planet, breathing in, breathing out, and trying the best we can to muddle through. A Year to Change Your Mind, Episode 8, by me, Dr. Lucy Maddox. This month, anger, irritability, and how to regulate big emotions. August. August in the UK is one of the hottest months, and a summer heatwave can feel like too much of a good thing. Anger also feels hot. It's not chance that we talk about needing to cool down after a row or to take the heat out of a situation. It turns out these heat-based metaphors fit well with the research on anger and hot weather. Hotter climates are associated with increased levels of anger and aggression. A whole range of studies have looked at the association, and when researcher Craig Anderson reviewed these in 1989, he found impressive correlations between heat and peaks in violent crimes. Craig Anderson's analysis found that hotter regions of the world, hotter years, hotter quarters of years, hotter seasons, months, and even days all correlate with relatively more aggressive behaviours, including murder, assault, riot, and domestic violence. So if we're more likely to be feeling a bit irritable at this time of year, perhaps it's worth us spending some time with anger. When young people I've worked with are referred for anger management, it's usually because an adult in their lives is finding their anger a problem, rather than the young person themselves. Should we always try to be squashing anger, though? Anger can be energising. Rage at how things shouldn't be can get us motivated to change a situation, as long as we can channel that anger constructively. Anger can be hard to harness in this way, though, especially for anyone in a minority position who's challenging the status quo. Nonetheless, anger can be a helpful signpost. There's usually a reason for it. Sometimes that's an injustice, sometimes it's a situation which is untenable or an unreasonable demand. Sometimes it's actually a cover for another emotion, like sadness or worry. In the intense environment of inpatient mental health wards where I've worked, angry outbursts can happen quite suddenly. On occasions when I've been involved in trying to help a young person and a staff team make sense of what has brought about a flashpoint of aggression or violence, there has always been a reason for it. Sometimes it's to do with frustration or a sense of injustice, but very often it's been to do with a sense of threat. The young person who ends up threatening the people around them has first of all felt under threat themselves. I've felt threatened myself on very rare occasions. I remember a young person slamming themselves against a door I was on the other side of and shouting into my face through the glass window in the door, leaving me feeling frightened to go into work the next day. Talking things through afterwards with the young person involved, it was clear that this was a very effective communication of how they were feeling at the time. Unsafe, out of control, at a loss of what to do, scared, vulnerable, and yes, angry too, at a system that felt unhelpful, or perhaps even harmful. Finding a way to recognise what we feel and how we're reacting to it sounds obvious, but can be really powerful. Let's think of John, a young man who feels a lot of understandable anger towards his family, who struggle to meet his needs for emotional closeness and support. John's family don't engage in conversations when he tries to highlight what he needs. Left alone with his emotions and unmet needs, his thoughts quickly become self-critical and spiral, attacking himself for how he feels, how he behaves, how unlovable he must be for people to keep ignoring him. To manage the feelings that these thoughts bring up, he uses a range of coping strategies, from starting rows about small things and shouting at other people close to him, to more obviously self-destructive behaviours like punching walls or getting into fights. John's anger is a real response to an emotionally painful situation. The therapeutic work John can do is not to squash or deny that he's angry, but to recognise other emotions that are also lurking, like deep sadness and fear of being alone, and then to spot unhelpful patterns that he's using to manage those feelings. Rouse and self-harm felt helpful in the past as a way of letting off steam, but he begins to recognise that he feels stuck in a pattern that leads to people around him being pushed further away, and to him feeling even more alone. In time, using individual therapy, John begins doing things differently. Not always, but more often than not. He pauses more before shouting, and works on learning some ways of soothing himself so that things don't go so fast from 0 to 100. He doesn't stop feeling angry, but he understands it more, acknowledges it more, and increasingly knows how to work with it. Learning how best to grapple with anger can pay dividends, and several types of therapy have some interesting takes on this. One school of thought which handles anger wisely is dialectical behaviour therapy. DBT was created to help with the extreme ups and downs in mood which come with chronic exposure to trauma, but the approach has been tested for other problems too, including difficulties with anger. A dialectic is a deep-rooted contradiction, and at the therapy's heart is the idea that both acceptance and change are necessary, even though they feel in opposition. It's important to accept who we are now and how things have been, as well as striving for positive change. I think of a dialectic as an impossible dilemma, such as, it's impossible for me to stop self-harming, and I need to stop self-harming. In relation to anger, this means it's useful to accept that we're feeling angry, possibly for several good reasons, at the same time as trying to do something more constructive with the emotion. DBT teaches a range of skills based on 4 key areas: emotional regulation, distress tolerance, mindfulness, and interpersonal effectiveness. Emotion regulation coaches people to appreciate all emotions as having value of some kind that can be harnessed, and it tries to help people recognise and name the emotion instead of squashing it, and to ride the wave of a big feeling rather than react impulsively. One exercise that DBT suggests harnesses the principle of opposite action. Whatever we're tempted to do, we should do the opposite. So if we're furious and we want to shout, we could instead make the effort to speak really softly and carefully. Although doing the exact opposite isn't always appropriate, the basic principle of this is strong. Making your partner or friend a cup of tea when you're feeling really hacked off instead of having a go might open up new possibilities for dialogue. Another emotion regulation idea which borrows a lot from more traditional cognitive therapy is the idea of checking the facts. We might feel like everything is totally unfair and we've been unjustly treated by everyone, but what are the objective facts? Principles of distress tolerance include the practices of radical acceptance and self-soothing. Even if something awful has happened, we work to accept that reality rather than causing ourselves more pain by constantly pushing it away. It doesn't mean we have to forgive people who've caused massive pain or accept the situation, but we can think something shouldn't have happened and at the same time acknowledge that it did. Self-soothing is another practice from distress tolerance and involves using all our senses to try to calm ourselves down. Mindfulness is the act of staying in the present moment instead of getting caught up in thoughts about the past or the future. Done well, I think it's one of the most helpful therapeutic skills I use. The more I do it, the more time I have between feeling an emotion and acting on it. A brief pause before reacting, which means I can respond slightly more intentionally. The final DBT skill set is interpersonal effectiveness. This is about balancing one's own needs with the needs of others, but without trampling all over someone else to get what you want, or negating what you need altogether. Talking to others when we're angry is a huge challenge. DBT suggests using several techniques to try to slow things down, keep calm and stay assertive, rather than flipping into being aggressive. FAST stands for be fair, don't apologise unless it's warranted, stick to your values, and be truthful. Having something to concentrate on as a guide to how we want to interact can be a helpful distraction if anger is building up, and can also help us to plan how we want to approach interactions. DBT is by no means the only therapeutic approach with something to say about anger. All types of therapy have something to add to the mix, but another which I've often used with people is acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT. Key to ACT is the idea that we can be more psychologically flexible in our lives if we pay attention to thoughts and feelings as temporary inner states, like an internal weather system blowing through, and think about ourselves more like the sky in this metaphor, rather than the clouds or the rain. So we are not our angry thoughts and feelings, and we can choose to behave in ways which are still committed to our core values that we want to live by. Crucially, we accept that those feelings are there, we don't try to push them away, neither do we hop on them and act according to them. Practicing seeing our thoughts and feelings as something that we can observe and don't need to act on can be one helpful step in coping with emotions that feel overwhelming. ACT also encourages us to try to see other people with compassion, as other flawed humans just like us. This is a type of perspective shift, seeing things through the eyes of the other person and acknowledging that they may have a different frame of reference to you. Dominic Mishkowski and colleagues set up an experiment to look at the effects of shifting our perspective, specifically trying to get some distance. In a series of experiments with students which were designed to irritate them during various tasks, they tested the effect of getting participants to recall the irritation from the first-person perspective or from the perspective of a fly on the wall. Taking the perspective of the fly was associated with less angry rumination and less aggressive behaviour. The cliché of kicking the dog when we're upset with someone else, often ourselves, is a cliché for a reason. It's often easier to think about being annoyed with someone else than it is to acknowledge problems we might have with ourselves. We can also turn anger in on ourselves. This is sometimes what is happening when people engage in self-harming behaviours. We can be involved in aggressions towards ourselves on a smaller scale too, making choices that on some level we know are counterproductive or unhelpful or actively self-sabotaging. These repeated loops of behaviour can be worth examining and trying to break. Trying to put a punctuation mark in after an angry interchange and not feeling like the episode has to spiral off into a whole day of being in a terrible mood is another thing that can work. Our bodies can sometimes help us do this. We can actually change our body's physiology by the way that we breathe. Breathing out for longer than we're breathing in can help to soothe us, activating our parasympathetic nervous system and making us feel calmer. So, while the heat of summer creates conditions which make us more likely to be irritable, taking the time to try to control how we use anger can give us a really helpful skill for all areas of our lives. A Year to Change Your Mind, Episode 9, by me, Dr. Lucy Maddox. This month, making the most of work and how we can craft our jobs to be better for us. September. September is back to school month. As an adult, I now feel this time mostly as a fresh start, with a sense of optimism in the slightly colder air. Work is a large part of who we are and how we live, and that means how we feel at work can affect our mood elsewhere too. That Sunday night feeling that the fun is over and that we're back on the treadmill in the morning can prompt heart sink. A back to work panicky feeling doesn't always mean we're in the wrong job. Sometimes it just means it's something new or outside of our comfort zone, which will stretch us and encourage us to grow. If we have it relentlessly though, then it might be that we're not in a job that's a good fit for us. Thinking about which aspects of our work we have control over can be a helpful first step. I recommend mapping out 2 concentric circles, like a picture of a fried egg. An inner circle with room for things that are within your control, and an outer one for things that are beyond your control. Sorting through the things that are getting you down at work and putting them in one or the other ring can illuminate subtle differences and help guide our actions. For example, I can't control a colleague's behaviour if she's consistently late to a meeting I chair. I can control what I choose to do about it. Do I stew silently, or do I try to make time to explore with the colleague why they're always late? If I choose not to speak to them, then maybe I also need to try to let my annoyance go, because I'm opting out of doing what I can about it. This brings us neatly to locus of control. That's where it is that we perceive the control is over a situation. We tend to attribute the cause or control of events either to ourselves or to something external to us. When we think that things are within our control, we're more likely to try to change them. Trying to find a project you can devote a small amount of time to each day can help shift how you feel about work just a little, and can also be something that might lead to fresh avenues of opportunity. This might be a passion that you decide to devote some of your own time to, like a love of drawing that you channel into a 10-minute sketch every day. You might also find opportunities within your current workday to do a project that you care about and that might help you transition to other areas. This is starting to sound a lot like job crafting, the idea that we can tweak and tailor our jobs to make them more of a good fit for us. I can't radically change the content of what I do. If I'm employed to be a psychologist, I can't suddenly say I want to write articles instead of providing therapy. But if I know I love creating things with words as well as doing my clinical work, then I can seize opportunities to write patient information or to be involved in therapeutic writing groups with people. The idea of job crafting came from Jane Dutton and Amy Resniewski. They started to study it about 20 years ago, when they got interested in how people alter their jobs to make them more meaningful. Hospital cleaners who change the way that they think about their job to think of themselves as a key part in healing, and consultants who manage to negotiate incorporating teaching and learning as key parts of what they do because they enjoy it so much. A good starting point for job crafting is often looking back at a couple of weeks of work and noticing when you felt happiest or in a state of flow, fully absorbed in what you're doing. Sometimes, even in a job where what we do is just what we like to do, we can still get caught up in worries that won't go away. It's an old joke that if you're asked what your flaws are in a job interview, you should say you're a perfectionist. But actually, clinical perfectionism is a real problem, which is so great it gets in the way of your everyday life and causes distress. Perfectionism involves holding ourselves to unrelenting and exacting standards which are impossible to achieve. It's a really hard thing to tackle because commonly, if we're motivated to make things perfect, then any suggestion of trying less hard can seem like an invitation to be mediocre. In fact, trying even 20% less hard, if we're being a perfectionist, often makes no noticeable difference to the outcome of what we're working on, but can make a massive difference to how much time and effort we're having to put in. Perfectionism can be exhausting because the relentless standards that perfectionists deal with are internal. They never go away. Amy's spent the last 6 years training to be a doctor, and she's about to become a GP. She doesn't feel happy about this. She feels exhausted. Her high standards mean she checks and double-checks her work to make sure it's correct. It means she's always worked later on placement than any of her colleagues, and she continues to think about work outside of hours. Amy doesn't want to continue for the rest of her career working all the hours there are and always feeling like she's somehow failing. At the same time, any thought of being less exacting makes her feel that she would be compromising patient safety. Treatment for clinical perfectionism involves several parts. The first step is to think about making a change. It's really hard to let go of perfectionist behaviours. However, it's just not sustainable to continually be putting in 100%, which can lead to exhaustion and burnout. Once there's the possibility of making a shift, the next step is thinking together about trying some experiments in action. Amy could think about how often she checks her notes and whether there might be room for checking them less. To try this is excruciatingly hard at first, but Amy notices that she doesn't make any more mistakes than before. She goes one step further and experiments with writing bullet point notes rather than long paragraphs of prose, something she's seen colleagues doing. It saves her time, and she gets surprising feedback that it's clearer for her colleagues to read than the longer, more involved version. Amy feels like if she isn't perfect as a doctor, then she would be dangerous and incompetent. This goes along with some unhelpful rules she has for herself. Things like, if I don't try harder than everyone else, I'll fail. Some of these rules had their roots in previous experiences. Amy remembers having failed a test when she hadn't worked as hard as usual. When she looked back, though, she had still got a good mark, just not as high as she was used to. She also remembers stories from medical school of clinical errors. She's not made one herself, but the thought of it fills her with dread. When she thought of errors her friends had made, she was able to see that none of them had been life-threatening, and that making a mistake sometimes is human and can even lead to further learning and better practice. Over time, Amy develops new rules for herself. I must try hard and check my work once, but checking more than this is unhelpful. Amy's feedback from colleagues and patients improves as she becomes less fixed on checking everything and staying late. She makes space in her week for herself as well as her work, and uses mindfulness practices whenever she has a few minutes. She feels more confident that she'll be able to manage the pressures of being a GP. Amy tries to remember that total perfection is impossible, and that good enough is enough. Sometimes the causes of stress are not so much about how we approach something, though, but about the conditions of the workplace. Someone else's unrelenting standards, for example, or expectations which are just impossible to meet. Working in mental health wards was a job I loved, but it did come with stresses. The work was never really finished, and worries about whether people were going to be okay was something which I found hard to leave at the door when I went home. This is often the flip side of doing a job you care about. You're probably more likely to care about it all the time, not just in work hours. Even in jobs which are inherently stressful, there are ways of managing work stress which can be helpful. One of these is being aware of how we respond to stress. Each of us does this in a slightly different way. When I teach groups of NHS staff about this, I refer to it as a stress signature. Our stress signature involves our bodies and also our thoughts and behaviours. When I start to get stressed at work, my body has some warning signs for me. Tense shoulders, tense jaw, and tension headaches are all nudges that prompt me to look at my diary to see if I can cancel a meeting or two. Similarly, if I notice that I'm catastrophising about how terrible things are going to be in the future, this might be a sign that I need a rest. Thinking about how to deal with stress at work is important, but so is the flip side, thinking about how to celebrate the good stuff. In the helping professions, there's a term, compassion fatigue, which describes the feeling of running out of the ability to care as much as before. There's also an alternative term, compassion satisfaction, which is the enjoyment we get from caring for and helping others. Celebrating those moments when we've made a difference in our work can boost our sense of purpose and our sense of efficacy. Sometimes, no matter how much energy we put into crafting our job and appreciating the good stuff in it, we might find that it's time to make a change. If the organisation isn't changing and the job is really stressful, or you feel the culture is toxic, then there may be a limit to how much you can reduce your stress. In this situation, you might be faced with thinking about how to leave. I think all therapists agree that it's important to end well. All endings are a loss, and as such they might resonate with other losses that a client has experienced and take on even more significance than they might otherwise. This can be true even when they're endings that are anticipated well in advance or wished for. In therapy, it's key to make sure that the ending isn't abrupt. This gives you both the chance to think about how the ending feels, what it means, what coping strategies will be taken forward from therapy. Ending a job, we might feel a mix of feelings, even about a place from where we feel ready to leave. We might usefully think about what we want to take with us. Which memories will we treasure? Which contacts will we maintain? Thinking about what you've achieved in the time there can really help to feel like you're moving on intentionally. Whether we stay or go, we bring our personal selves to our professional roles, and our personal and professional lives affect each other. Looking back and feeling like we've learnt and grown and changed, at least a little, can only be a good thing, however painful that learning might sometimes be at the time. A Year to Change Your Mind, Episode 10, by me, Dr. Lucy Maddox. This month, ways to help us cope with loss and be kind to ourselves in the face of grief. October. October in the UK is full of falling leaves being trodden into the pavement. Autumn into winter can feel like a painful transition. The cold makes us tense up, and the nights drawing in can bring a feeling of claustrophobia. Marking the halfway point between autumn equinox and winter solstice, the old Celtic festival of Samhain was associated with going deeper into the darker part of the year. It was supposedly a time when the boundary between this world and the other world grew thinner. Spirits could visit, and souls of the dead could return to their homes. Autumn and winter happen every year, but the change can still feel melancholy. It makes me think of other cycles of loss we experience throughout our lives. We will all be touched by loss, whether that's the ending of a relationship, the loss of people we love through bereavement, or other losses. Grief is suffering or distress over loss. We're really bad in the UK at talking about death. It's painful to think about it, this ultimate separation, so we try not to. There are a handful of exceptions, initiatives like death cafes, whose facilitators try to encourage conversations about death, dying and bereavement. The Good Grief Trust, which has a wealth of information on its website. Death doulas, practitioners who help individuals and families to have a good death. And staff who work in hospices, managing both the physical and emotional pain associated with the end of life. Grief doesn't only relate to death. Relationship breakups, redundancies, traumatic experiences of all kinds are hard for us to negotiate. If there is anything which is in the public consciousness about grief, it's the idea that it moves through stages. This comes from the writing of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, author of On Death and Dying and On Grief and Grieving. She wrote about 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. She never intended these to be seen as a linear progression, but somehow they've often been taken to be a process that we should all go through to get to the end point of acceptance. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross actually suggested we might go back and forth through any of these stages, flipping back to denial at any point, or fast-forwarding to depression. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model encourages us to see grief as a process which involves multiple different emotions. I've experienced grief as many different feelings and thoughts. These have included anger at people who've died, deep sadness, and a kind of wishful thinking, running through how things might have been in a parallel universe if the person I'm grieving were still alive. The sudden, unexpected death of a younger person felt absolutely horrific to me, whilst the expected death of an older person felt hugely sad but less violent. These feelings and thoughts take emotional energy, and grief can be exhausting and feel all-consuming, whether it relates to a death or to another type of loss. It can make us forget things, misplace things, and have trouble functioning as we normally would. Grief can also sometimes feel like anxiety, like nothing is safe. It can cause panic attacks as we flail around, trying to carry on as before, when there's been a seismic shift in our reality. It can have other physical symptoms too, including headaches and bodily aches and pains. Avoiding thinking about loss is one way of dealing with it. Psychodynamic theory talks about the manic defense of keeping so busy that we can't feel different emotions. CBT would talk more about avoidance. Sometimes we need to reflect on the difficult and the painful to make some meaning of it. With painful breakups or lost opportunities, there often is a glimmer of a sense that things might be better down the line, whereas with losses such as the death of a loved one, there's much less comfort available. If we're lucky, then the sense of a good death might be there, a lack of pain, a chance to say everything we wanted to say and to hear everything our loved one wanted to tell us. In more sudden deaths, there's little comfort. Either way, the mental reconfiguration of the world that's necessary to realise that the person is no longer here with us is huge. In the therapy room, grief is sometimes part of the bigger picture of what people are bringing. Usually grief, over time, doesn't go away but becomes more manageable. Sometimes it doesn't though, and traumatic grief is when someone has a post-traumatic reaction to a death or a loss. Post-traumatic reactions relate to how much our brains might struggle to process and experience. Post-trauma reactions can be brutal. Imagine something terrible happening and then being forced to replay that thing on a loop in your thoughts when you're least wanting to. This could be in the form of flashbacks, where it literally feels like you're back in whichever traumatic event you've experienced, so it's happening now. Or it could be in the form of intrusive thoughts, memories, or nightmares. All this makes you feel in a permanent state of high alert. This might feel like being permanently on edge. It might show up as irritation, pushing your loved ones away from you. You might experience panic attacks where it feels like you can't breathe. You might feel a sense of guilt or shame or self-blame around whatever occurred. Trauma reactions tend to occur when there's been a fear of something bad happening, like death or the possibility of death, either your own or someone else's. It doesn't matter whether or not this happened. This way of overcoming trauma memories might seem counterintuitive, but one approach, from CBT, involves going through them in more detail, often with someone else. The rumination and intrusive thoughts that post-trauma reactions bring with them is our brain's attempt to tidy the memories away to some degree, but because they're hot with emotion, it's hard to do. Part of what trauma therapy can do is to help people take the heat out of the memory by helping the person remember that they're in the here and now, that they're safe, and often enabling them to introduce new, more stable thoughts about what the event might mean. Traumatic grief reactions can involve intrusive memories about events leading up to a death, or the death itself, or events after a death. They might also involve grief around an experience, for example a near-death experience, belief that someone was in grave danger, or an experience which happened in a traumatic way. Clinical level post-traumatic stress disorder, which gets in the way of someone being able to live their life as they would like, is best dealt with by an evidence-based talking therapy rather than any kind of attempt at self-help. But some of the same principles from post-trauma work can be useful. These include things like piecing together a timeline of what happened, or writing about it or making drawings to enable the brain to process it and tidy it away. When we have big losses in our lives which we haven't had the chance to process, they can sometimes come back and surprise us. Memories might get triggered by a smaller loss, leaving us feeling totally at sea without knowing why our reaction is so huge. What we're experiencing is a kind of emotional resonance with what's gone before, the other loss which we felt keenly and haven't fully mourned. Sometimes these losses go right back to early relationships we had with people we were attached to, our early caregivers, for instance. Other times the losses might be fresher, for example a painful breakup that we never quite understood. For overwhelming grief which persists, I think it's helpful to seek assistance from a trained therapist. Let's think about Tara. She's just broken up with a partner who she's had a tricky relationship with. The breakup was a fairly mutual decision. They wanted different things for the relationship, She wanted to feel a sense of progress, but planning for the future made him feel stifled. In the mix was a tendency for him to speak to her in a way that undermined her. There were good reasons for the breakup, and rationally, Tara thought they'd made the right decision. But she just felt awful. She found herself thinking about her ex all the time, crying unexpectedly and feeling totally bereft. She felt stuck. Tara found herself thinking about other relationships which had ended too, and experiencing a sense of abandonment, aloneness, and finality that she remembered from other times in her life, including a bereavement she'd experienced as a teenager. Tara used therapy sessions to talk about her ex and their relationship. As she did this, and used a journal to write things down, she realised there were repeating themes of positives and negatives. It was easier to think of the positives now they weren't together, but there had been negative things too, reasons for the breakup. In some ways, Tara was mourning a relationship that she wished she had had, rather than the one which had ended. In time, Tara found that hanging out with friends and asking them about their lives instead of spending all the time talking about her ex helped her to see the world was still turning, and she was still part of it. Tara was also encouraged by therapy to think about how she would care for a good friend who was going through the same situation. She tried to encourage herself to eat healthily, do some gentle exercise, and provide herself with opportunities to relax. It was a balance of time spent mourning and time spent trying to keep on keeping on that helped get Tara through, until one day she felt like things were not quite as bad. As months passed, she spoke about herself more and more in therapy, and the space the ended relationship took up got smaller. Tara hasn't forgotten the loss, it's just become folded into the rest of her life in a more manageable way. It is, however, possible to forget even the hugest loss momentarily. I remember periods of grieving, both for my grandparents and for the end of a relationship, where for the first few moments after waking, I just hadn't registered yet that those losses had happened. Even years after their deaths, I find myself wanting to introduce my grandparents to someone or tell them about something. In some respects, this is a way of carrying them with me. It's comforting. The traditions of Samhain and Day of the Dead realise this and help us to celebrate the connection we have to others who are long gone, instead of trying to pretend it's not there. Grief is in some ways the flip side of the coin from love. We suffer because we've cared deeply about someone or something. A risk when grief is overwhelming is that we shut down and refuse to be open to caring that much again, because the loss is so great that the idea of having such hurt again feels insurmountable. To get through the smaller daily losses and disappointments of life, and the bigger sadnesses which totally floor us, is not about being graceful in the face of grief. It's about getting through it and surviving in a wild and tender time. In the tradition of Samhain, who would we want to invite to dine with us again? And how can we invite back the people who've gone? Is there a shared value we can cherish to honour them? Or if our grief is for the loss of an experience, is there a new or past experience that we can try to hold dear? Not as compensation, but as a reminder of the things which did go as we'd hoped, or which went even better than we'd imagined. A Year to Change Your Mind, Episode 11, by me, Dr. Lucy Maddox. This month, when hibernation seems appealing, why rest is so important and how to do it better. November. November is a time of year when it's easy to feel tired. In the Northern Hemisphere, the clocks have fallen backwards, ushering in the season of dark mornings and evenings. As we know from research into the effects of seasonal affective disorder, less light can make us feel less happy and more fatigued. At this time more than ever, we really need to pay attention to rest. And what happens to us if we don't? Let's think about Jack. He feels bad, but he's not sure why. Jack's training as a psychiatrist and finding this rewarding but difficult. He's gone into a career in mental health because of some of his own experiences with family members, but he's increasingly feeling worried that he himself might be worn down by the work and unable to help people as much as he wants to. Jack has lots of things he does to help himself feel better. He goes out to the pub after work with his colleagues. He captains a football team one night a week. And every Saturday, he spends time online dating. On top of this, he's working shifts, some of them night shifts. Jack reliably finds that he cycles through feeling productive and on top of things, through to feeling overwhelmed and like there's too much on, then to feeling totally exhausted and getting a cold the minute he has a couple of days off. It's always when I stop, he says, and thinks that maybe the answer is to just keep going. Jack's experience is not uncommon. It turns out there are good reasons why. Our immune system is primitive. The same system that helps us fight off colds today is the one which evolved in a time when we would have been running away from saber-toothed tigers. In prehistoric situations, we needed to run fast, fight, or play dead in order to survive. So the immune system evolved in a way which takes cues from our stress system. It postpones us getting sick if we're experiencing stress responses. It switches everything else off in order to be able to engage in fight or flight. The trouble is that our stresses nowadays are chronic stresses like work pressures, unhelpful relationships, and financial worries. When we're chronically stressed, our bodies are left flooded with stress hormones, such as cortisol, for a long time. Cortisol directly communicates with the immune system and regulates how it works. Most often, this results in a lowering of immune surveillance. The immune system is down-regulated and can't be as vigilant or effective in combating the millions of things that we encounter daily. When the stress stops, the immune system can recover and upregulate again and work to get rid of the infections we've picked up in this period. If we do get sick, it's unhelpful to ignore our body's signals for needing rest. It's a sign our body's immune system is working, making us slow down. Resting sooner rather than later will help us to recover faster. The threat system is the brain system involved in spotting a threat in the environment and preparing us to run, hide, or fight. Back in the day, this system helped us spot predators. Now it kicks in as we scan situations for social risks, work terrors, or relationship frights. The threat system overrides the immune system to make sure our energy is more concentrated on the current environment, postponing any immune response that may be needed now until later. A second system is the parasympathetic nervous system, involved in resting and digesting. This system is also involved in attachments and closeness with others. It's one that kicks in when we're safe, secure, and content, the soothing system. The rest and digest system works in opposition to the fight or flight system. When one is activated, the other is down-regulated, a bit like when we use a brake pedal or accelerator in a car. We don't just ping between feeling threatened or soothed. Sometimes we're motivated to be chasing goals for good reasons. And a third system, our drive system, kicks in and gives us a sense of achievement when we succeed. Most people are not using the soothe system as much as the others. Connections in our brains get strengthened by use, so if we don't use a system as much, it's also likely to be less easily triggered than the others. The more we feel threatened or revved up, the easier it is to feel that way again. Weirdly, jumping in cold water also activates the parasympathetic system. This is one reason why cold water swimming is supposed to be so beneficial for our mental health. It activates the vagus nerve, which is a long cranial nerve running from the brain to different organs and tissues in the body, responsible for regulating autonomic nervous system activity. Stimulating the vagal nerve helps to slow our heart rate and relax our body. In the November of the year I moved to Bristol, I went on holiday with the man I'd met in May. We went to Iceland, flying from one dark and cold country to another even more dark and cold country. The daylight hours were limited. The people in Iceland seem to know how to make the most of these limited hours of sunshine, and know how to appreciate the darkness too. Iceland's volcanic location means it has a huge array of geothermally heated pools, both naturally occurring ones and built swimming pools. We went swimming one day in a public pool in Reykjavik, and they had a candle lit in reception, just as they did on the cafe tables in the local bakery. It made for a sense of coziness. Inside, in the indoor pool, we had it nearly to ourselves to swim lengths, only realising afterwards that outside was where the real deal was. A series of saunas and increasingly hotter hot pools were full of people relaxing after their day at work, with the cold water bucket there for in-between hot sits and soaks. They knew how to rest. Prioritising the soothing system doesn't necessarily mean that we can't work intensively and then take a break. For some people this works well, as long as there's some recovery time at some point. We can't decide when something emotionally hard is going to happen. If the stresses aren't avoidable and we can't change the level of demand that's upon us, then one thing we can do is build in time for nice things anyway. Finding small things that give us pleasure and peppering our lives with them as regularly as possible can be protective. When Jack looks at what he's doing day to day, he's mostly engaged in things which involve his drive system or his threat system. There's nothing there which involves the parasympathetic soothing system. Even lunch is eaten on the run. He hates baths. He dislikes meditation. He prefers things where he feels alive because he's moving fast or dealing with problems of some kind. Eventually, he settles on a few restful moments, reading the paper in bed at the weekend, lying down on the couch and listening to at least one song when he gets in from work. Jack has to schedule rest to make it happen. The more he manages to keep a bit of space for rest, though, the better he feels. In fact, the more he craves it. He starts making sure one night a week is at home, just chilling out. He begins to get sick a bit less often. He starts to have more space to think about how he wants things to be. Sometimes we stuff our time full of things so that we don't have to acknowledge the bits that are missing. Jack begins to be aware that despite all his work colleagues and friends, he feels quite lonely. This takes a bit of acknowledging, but it also means that he now has the choice to do something about it. It's not just rest that Jack struggles with, it's also sleep. Rest without sleep is important, but sleep itself has its own unique benefits. A lack of sleep has been associated with poorer mental and physical health, although we know less about the mechanisms by which this happens. Shift work is now seen as an occupational hazard. Not only is it isolating to be operating at a different time to everyone else, but the change to our sleep cycle also seems to be detrimental to our health. In a night of sleep, we cycle through different sleep phases, from stage 1 to 4, with rapid eye movement, or REM sleep, as part of this too. It's during REM sleep that we dream, and that we're more likely to wake up because we're sleeping more lightly. We know that depriving humans and animals of sleep has negative effects on mental performance and physical health. Anyone who's experienced sleep deprivation will be able to vouch for the moodiness and difficulty making decisions or learning anything new which comes with it. Theories of why we need sleep include thinking that it's necessary to consolidate memories and learning, to restore the cells in our bodies and brains, and to reduce our energy expenditure. Although this all sounds very plausible, we still don't really know exactly how sleep does all this, or why it's so important in so many animals. Sleeplessness is frustrating, lonely, and common. Approximately 1 in 10 adults experience persistent and severe insomnia with daytime consequences, which means that 10% of people find it hard to sleep on 3 or more nights a week and have had this problem for at least 3 months. In adults over 65, this figure rises dramatically, estimated as 1 in 5. It might be that it's hard to get to sleep, hard to stay asleep, or both. The knock-on effects the following day can be sleepiness, irritability, teariness, poor performance at work or home, arguments with friends and family, and many more. So while insomnia can feel like a nighttime problem, it really is a 24-hour disorder. Long-term sleep difficulties are associated with an increased likelihood of developing depression. Thinking about how we prepare ourselves for sleep can help to set us up well, and remembering evidence-based strategies for getting back to sleep if we suffer from insomnia, including, counterintuitively perhaps, getting up and doing something else for a bit instead of lying there clock-watching. The idea that insomnia is something we can't change is one example of a thought about sleeplessness that might be unhelpful, as it might lead us to have a learned helplessness about the problem. Learned helplessness is when we stop trying to fix something because we've tried a few times and nothing has worked. Racing thoughts at bedtime are another common problem. Often people lie awake chewing over things that have happened that day. Try writing worries down in a notebook by the bed to leave the day behind before you go to sleep. Sleep hygiene refers to the basics of behaviour and environment that we can pay attention to in order to promote sleep. For Jack, his psychiatrist training hours mean he's intermittently on night shifts, and there's nothing he can do about that. He can control some other aspects of his evenings, though. He starts to try what he routinely advises his own patients to do. Not drinking coffee late in the day. Not binging on his phone just before sleeping. Trying to have the lights in his flat lower for a bit and do something relaxing just before bed. However small, however insignificant it might feel, those moments of stopping, savouring, and maybe even sleeping can help November feel like a cosy cocoon instead of a claustrophobic, miserable month. Embracing the chance to rest can make all the difference. A Year to Change Your Mind, Episode 12, by me, Dr. Lucy Maddox. This month, how to negotiate families and manage expectations, especially when family relationships come under pressure. December. I lived in Paris for a year in my early 20s. I moved there with my good friend Katie to teach English, just after university when we didn't know what we really wanted to do. It was a good idea, and it made the usual difficulties of our early 20s feel somehow more romantic and dramatic against the backdrop of a whole new city in a whole new country. For me, Paris will always be a beautiful place, crammed with the foreign thrill of people speaking French, tiny bars, street art, hidden squares, and dark, cosy cafes. Not everyone feels this way, though. There's a thing called Paris syndrome, a rare city-specific problem first written about in the 1980s, where tourists get so disorientated by being in Paris that they become panicked and upset. It's linked with feelings of disappointment that the French capital isn't as they've seen in films and read about in novels. I think Christmas is a bit like Paris. The expectation, the pressure, and the feeling of melancholy when things don't land how they did in your imagination. The expectations we have of group celebrations, particularly Christmas, are often cosy, connected, calm. In reality, such celebrations are usually littered with potential stresses. There can be a tricky contrast between what we imagine everyone else to be having, the perfect Walton's Christmas, and whatever is actually going on for us. Maybe a Christmas where the tension can be sliced with a knife. It's one thing to feel sad, but a whole extra layer of pain if you're also beating yourself up about feeling sad because you think you should be happy. The concept of radical acceptance can be useful here. Accepting the reality of what's going on, even if it's painful. Radical acceptance is an idea which comes from dialectical behaviour therapy. It means we accept what we can't change, rather than struggling against our current reality. We can't always control family rituals or behaviours at Christmas, but we can try to control how we respond to them. It can help to plan in advance, working out the bits we can control and how we want to do them. What would create a different dynamic? Is there a different way of responding to others' needs while also meeting our own? Eating disorders and self-harm are two problems which can ramp up around Christmas, and although these might seem like extremes of behaviour, they're maybe not so far removed from some of the ways we all cope, so I think we can all learn a lot from the therapy used to tackle them. Christmas is so food-focused that it's unsurprising eating disorders can get much worse at this time of year. In therapy for eating disorders, clear expectations of what's healthy to eat and monitoring of weight are part of the treatment, but individual therapy is much more about trying to grow the parts of someone's identity that the eating disorder has taken over, and reminding the sufferer of what the downsides might be to letting thoughts about calories take over. One of the most effective treatments for eating disorders includes working with a person's family as well as the individual. Family therapy for eating disorders tries to help people look at what their individual relationship with food is doing to the relationships with the people around them. Eating disorders often make other people in the family micromanage what someone is eating, or give other family members the feeling of being hugely disempowered. Multifamily systemic therapy for eating disorders is a type of therapy which involves several families at once. Children might swap parents for a lunchtime to see what happens when the parents are looking after someone else's child, and this is often interesting. Children might eat more for the parents who aren't their own, and parents might be able to speak more calmly when they're advocating this with another couple's child. It depends who's there on Christmas Day, but sometimes, if we're going back to our family of origin, we slip into speaking in ways that we wouldn't if we had someone witnessing it, or in ways that we wouldn't to someone else's family member. Why is it okay to be so much ruder to our own? Trying to see things from someone else's perspective frees us up from our own head a bit as well. If we're thinking about making the day nice for someone else, we might be less invested in it being a certain way for us, which can help shake some of that Christmas expectation. Studies of general well-being at Christmas show that people tend to feel worse at this time of year, with one exception. Followers of Christianity tend to feel happier. Maybe it's because there's a higher spiritual meaning that can be tapped into, again helping people to sidestep their own expectations and think about the needs of others and the meaning of the day with a wider lens. I'm often astounded by how much people manage to accomplish in therapy, and in multifamily therapy, I've seen families run with the lightest of prompts and create important conversations about what their family relationships are like. Therapy conversations are like wedding speeches. We don't really have these heartfelt and amazing conversations day to day in families, but it's often all there under the surface. And why wait to say the good stuff? Just because Christmas is a time of traditions doesn't mean we have to stick to the same unhelpful ones year after year. If you know your family tradition is that everyone drinks too much and has a massive messy row, then that might be something you want to steer clear of. What's a new tradition, just for yourself, that you could put in its place? Doing something different when we're used to doing things in a certain way can be tricky. Consider Jo, who uses self-harm in different ways. She describes feeling an overwhelming avalanche of different emotions all at once, and using self-harm to punctuate these somehow. She sometimes feels numb and disconnected, and uses self-harm to feel something again. Jo's aware of how she uses this coping strategy. It's the most effective shortcut she has in the moment for managing those overwhelming feelings or those absences of feeling, and so it's a tough habit to kick. I think we all engage in behaviours that are counterproductive sometimes. There's usually something we do that helps us manage feelings that we find difficult in the short term, but that might not be so great for us in the medium to long term. Christmas is a time when emotions can run high, and it can be useful to be aware, like Jo is, of the traps we might fall into when we're trying to cope. Are we likely to drink too much on Christmas Day because we're nervous about a family dynamic? And is this likely to backfire in a messy row? We've all got something we do as an unhelpful way of coping, often on autopilot. When people come to therapy for self-harm, they might be at different stages of wanting to make a change. Many of the young people I've met while working in acute mental health wards were initially pretty sure they didn't want to stop self-harming. It was one of the few things making them feel better. It had often got them into an impossible situation, though, where everyone around them was desperate for them to make a shift. With time and reflection, they could also see some problems with it. Whatever the level of motivation to change, it's often helpful to begin in a similar way, trying to make sense together of what's going on, why, and what helps. Hopefully, throughout the time I meet with someone, we will expand the what helps. A next step is often one borrowed from motivational interviewing. Motivational interviewing is an approach used a lot in addiction services, developed in the 1980s by William R. Miller from Norway and his colleague Stephen Rolnick. Miller and Rolnick developed a way of working with people experiencing addiction which shifted from advising people what to do to trying to get alongside someone and letting them explore the pros and cons of their behaviour for themselves, so the ideas are coming from the person seeking help rather than being foisted onto them. Jo is using self-harming as a way of managing overwhelming feelings, and also as a way of making herself feel something when she feels numb or empty. Although self-harm helps in the short term, she finds herself feeling disgusted soon afterwards, and she's finding it hard to hide self-harm from her partner, which is another source of shame. Jo wants to have some ways of managing other than self-harm, and when she draws out the pros and the cons of self-harm, this is confirmed. For self-harm to be an ongoing problem, there must be some perceived payoff. For Jo, the payoff is the sense of either relief from her mess of feelings or the sense of coming back to reality from being disconnected, and these are powerful motivations. The downsides are more numerous, though. She doesn't want to have to explain her self-harm scars to anyone, and she doesn't want to be stuck with the guilty, shameful feelings afterwards. She writes these things down. Jo's already tried some alternatives to self-harm. In fact, she's tried a lot of things, and lots of them haven't helped. One or two things have helped, though, and she's also up for experimenting with other stuff she hasn't tried. In between therapy sessions, she has a go at some other strategies, and finds a couple extra to add to her repertoire. She doesn't need all the alternatives to work, she just needs a few things that do. It's the same for anyone. You actually only need one, or maybe optimally a few more ways of managing, so that you feel like you have a range of techniques at your disposal. Jo works hard at setting up reminders in advance to help her practice the stuff that might make self-harm less likely. These are things like deep breathing, relaxation strategies, time to herself at regular intervals. She also considers the idea of what roadblocks she might use if she feels about to self-harm. Things like looking at a picture of her and her friends on her phone, and remembering she didn't want to have to hide her self-harm from them, and reminding herself that she could do this, that she'd already gone however many days without self-harming. For all of us, if there are behaviours we really want to avoid over Christmas, then it's worth planning ahead and thinking about what will take the pressure off during the run-up and the day itself. An important part of working on self-harm, which can be applied to other self-sabotaging behaviours too, comes from solution-focused therapy. It's the idea of spotting progress and amplifying it. Self-harm is never around 24/7, so what's going on when it's not around? Asking these questions suddenly flips things on their head and makes the conversation more about the huge swathes of time where people are coping really well, rather than the small amounts of time where it all feels too much. Similarly, at Christmas, it's rare that the whole thing is a total disaster. What happens in the nice bits, and how can we grow them? If you think back to past Christmases where things have gone well, how can you replicate that or increase it? Whatever helped, think about how you can have that plan up your sleeve, and try to celebrate the things that are going well. It doesn't have to be the most amazing Christmas for it to be worth celebrating. Maybe it's just good enough. In the end, Christmas is just another day. I'm wishing you a good one though. You've been listening to A Year to Change Your Mind by me, Dr. Lucy Maddox. It was abridged by Catherine Williams and produced by Allegra McElroy. It's a BBC Books production for BBC Sounds.